Magick.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on Magick.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You are really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magick.me, magick.me. Welcome back to the podcast. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And I think this is your third visit.
I think so.
But for those who have maybe not caught up on the other episodes, which you should definitely listen to the other ones, why don't you let people know a little bit about yourself, your books, and your background?
Sure. Yeah. Well, my last two books are The Path of the Warrior Mystic, Being a Man in an Age of Chaos, and The Three Stages of Initiatic Spirituality, Craftsman, Warrior, Magician. And I wrote a few histories of Freemasonry prior to that. And I've been involved in the esoteric and related fields, martial arts for a few decades. And I grew up in England, but I've lived in New York and USA for most of the last 25 years.
Gotcha. Okay. And we were bouncing ideas back and forth about what to talk about before the podcast. But you mentioned your involvement in one of the most infamous occult events of the 20th century, the Ice Magick Wars. And I can't resist asking you about this.
Yeah. So, well, I will tread a little carefully because, I saw things and heard things and we're told things that aren't really public. But, and I probably should respect people's privacy. I joined when I was 19, which would have been around 1980. And it was pretty much soon after that it all started. Actually, in fact, I think it might even have begun before I joined, and then I sort of found out a little bit later on.
And what may have been just for the audience, what was it that you joined? Since we probably aren't getting the pre-podcast conversation.
Yeah, sorry, that was very obscure. So I joined the Illuminists of Thanatos when I was 19, which was I mean, it is still going, I suppose. But Peter Carroll, founder and the author of Libanon and Psychonaut, among other books, he hasn't been involved in the Illuminists of Thanatos for years. I think he left about 4 years after I left. I was only involved with it for a year, maybe a little more than a year. But for those who don't know, it's a chaos magic order, and really the sort of premier chaos magic order. And at the time, I would say, at least when Peter Carroll was involved, that it was a kind of creative endeavor. Lots of experimentation, some emphasis on art. Ian Reid was the head of the temple I belonged to. His involvement is well known, but he was also the editor of Chaos International at the time. I published a couple of illustrations in Chaos International under a pseudonym, which I will not mention. But it was a kind of crazy time. And another person who was in the temple who was also known to be a member, Nick Hall, I would stay over at his apartment and he would come over and stay at mine. But it was a very transient lifestyle, which I think sort of added to the atmosphere of this sort of weird sort of feeling of being under siege. For those who don't know what the Ice Magick War is, a sort of conflict between not all members of the English IoT and the German IoT, but certainly some pretty significant members. And several members of the IoT in those countries anyway. So, and it really was a time of extraordinary paranoia. I feel looking back on it, and that was partly because it was also a time of the first Gulf War, if I remember correctly, and so there was a sense of being under siege anyway, with this sort of looming war with sort of biblical symbolism of the beast of Babylon behind it. And I would say as well that a lot of that symbolism just seemed to come up in the IoT, and there were lots of coincidences that would make one paranoid. But it was sort of an interesting time. Other than that, it was creative and unusual, and it was probably good to do it at 19 and not 29 or 39.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I also was in the IoT for 7 years.
Yeah.
And from the age of about 17, 18 to 26, and I ended up running their was in charge of the temple in New York, and during the mid 2000s, I was Magister Templi of the New York Temple, which I started with my other friends in the pact there. I don't talk about that basically ever.
Yeah.
Largely because I'm not in it anymore. I also, I don't want to violate people's privacy. The group is, I think, rightfully private. It's nice to have things off the internet, not open to the public eye. And also, I also don't know where the group is now. I mean, I don't want everyone banging down the doors to it or something, because I have no idea who they are or where they're at now. I haven't been involved since the mid 2000s. But I do credit it as the IoT for me was, I suppose, as important. It was like my primary initiatory matrix. It was the, how do I want to put it? I was very, very, very active in it, and, met everyone in the US, met everyone in the UK, met quite a few of the people from Germany who came over to the UK. Although this was a different era. I think at the era that you're talking about, there was an American section, but it was like Doug Grant, who later committed suicide, unfortunately.
Oh, wow.
I apologize. I didn't know you didn't know that. I don't know if you've met him.
No, I mean, I don't actually know who he was, but that's kind of horrible.
He was the first IoT person in the US, and he ran an art gallery called Perihelion in Phoenix, Arizona, which may still be there. And he also ran Dagon Productions, if you remember that publishing company.
I don't actually.
But anyways, that was in the 90s. I was in much later. I mean, late 90s, starting in the late 90s. I do feel like it played the same role in my life as I suppose like the Golden Dawn did in Crowley's or Dion Fortune.
Right.
And as much as it's the matrix with which I went from non-initiated into expressing myself as an initiated person, and went through all those, trials and experiences over 7 years, and abysses and all of that. So
that's a long time.
Yeah. Anyways, just giving some context there. But I think that one thing that I want to zero in on in terms of this story is, what was chaos magic at the time? Meaning, how did Peter Carroll define it? Because chaos magic now is kind of a meaningless term. It really is. And even when I was involved, it was kind of meaningless outside of the IoT. And I think that it would be the same as like, people actually going through the system of the Golden Dawn with lots of other people and initiations and things like that, versus people, doing an LBRP or getting a few correspondences out of a Llewellyn book or something like that.
Right.
So people have this idea of chaos magic, like, sigils, and they have the idea of chaos magic they have is from later people that popularized it in the late 90s. But chaos magic, in my experience, certainly within that group and in the early 90s, was a totally different thing. So, and it may have been different in my era and yours, particularly being around Peter Carroll. So I think we should maybe just define up front and give your thoughts on that
definitely.
context.
I think I only met Peter Carroll a couple of times, and I spoke to him on the phone a couple of times. He actually initiated me, not in London, not because he came down to initiate me because I was so important, but because just by coincidence he happened to be visiting that month. So that was kind of cool. But I don't know what he would have thought chaos magic would be, since I only contacts with him a few times, but I would say within the only London temple at that time, it wasn't really a sort of there wasn't really any emphasis on science, such as you really found with Peter Carroll, at least in some of his books. There was one member who was, talked about doing, magic through computers and this sort of thing, but that wasn't really an emphasis. It seemed to be mostly that the individuals were sort of interested in, sort of Crowley, the runes, and sort of grimoire. One of Nicole was probably more into sort of grimoire, maybe not grimoire magic, but sort of grimoire aesthetic. And I think really the only thing that bound the group together was a sort of aesthetic and a sense of foreboding and a sense that we're in kind of Ragnarok or something like that. Maybe not in that term, but I think that was it. There wasn't really any. There wasn't really a structure as such. Any member of the temple could come and bring rituals and experiment. I think the idea was more that we're experts and we're bringing our expertise to kind of learn more from each other. If there was any kind of practical emphasis, it was probably sort of entering trance states. I think that was something that was important. But otherwise I wouldn't. There was not really a structure as such. So.
Right. One thing that I heard from Donald Michael Craig before he died, which you may have a perspective on this, is this may or may not be true. I have no way of checking this unless you happen to know anything about it. There was, in the 70s, the very, infamous kind of people clustered around that occult bookshop in Leeds that led to kind of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, that led to the kind of the birth of chaos magic. And Don Craig told me that Peter Carroll and the rest of them, their primary initiator was Amato Crowley, who...
Really?
Yes. I can tell that you know who this is from the tone of your voice. And for those who don't, because no one remembers this person, he was kind of this guy in England that was constantly publishing these loony books saying that he was the son of Aleister Crowley. And Don Craig said that the reason that Peter Carroll came up with chaos magic is they couldn't find anyone to actually initiate them into Thelemic magic, so they just ended up kind of doing their own thing. That may or may not be true. I have no idea.
Yeah, it sounds suspicious because one of the old, well, in fact, the oldest member, at least in terms of his age, in the London Temple had been a member of the OTOs.
Okay,
I think for a few years as well. So, and I don't think he was the only former member of the OTO in the IoT. So, the Ordo Templi Orientis being the group associated with Crowley. But so that sounds kind of suspicious to me. I could be wrong. But it sounds weird.
It did sound weird to me as well. But maybe there's some missing context there, or maybe it was overstated. But apparently they were in contact with Amato Crowley, which I thought was hilarious if it is true.
Yeah. Although, as you know, it's kind of a small world, right, where everybody kind of knows everybody in those circles.
For sure. So then this event, the Ice Magick Wars, which sounds like a Dungeons and Dragons game gone bad. It does not sound like well-balanced people, but this was I think fairly critical for it's certainly important for occult history. So what went down?
That's right. Yeah, I wasn't really directly involved in doing anything. I mean, maybe I was, in the sense that they were, from my recollection, that there may have been one or two things that the temple did sort of magically or whatever. But, when we met, but other than that, I didn't really have much involvement in it. I'm not going to say any names or give too many details, but it created some upheaval in regard to the structure, as a couple of members left to go and study ice magic and then returned about 6 weeks later, and they'd given up their apartment and their lives were kind of really an upheaval over that, because they'd gone, ostensibly forever, and then returned and didn't have very many, didn't have any nice things to say about ice magic. I don't know the other side, of course, but the main thing I would say was it just sort of caused chaos in the sort of running of things, and respect for people, and the kind of hierarchy. But yeah, as for actual doing sort of black magic or anything, I didn't really see very much of that. I mean, there was a little bit, I'm sure, but nothing that I really nothing really outrageous anyway. Let's put it that way.
The way that I interpreted the story, at least hearing it secondhand, was that kind of there was this, there was the English chaos magic scene, and then people kind of went over to Germany to meet acquaintances, specifically Ralph Tegmeyer, and we should call him Frater UD, or as he's known in German, Frater VD, which did not translate, writing books about sex magic.
It doesn't translate well, no.
But it was interesting because when I was in Germany in the mid 2000s, like his books were everywhere, and like he's like the guy in Germany. It's like the bookshelves are just stuffed with books in German by him. Wow, which was interesting.
He gave me a blurb actually for I think it was the last one or the one before that. Yeah, the one before that. So
that's great. I would love to have him on the podcast. He's now like a he's just kind of like this kind of affable boomer SEO consultant that consults for German companies on their search engine rankings.
Well, he's an interesting guy. I mean, I've heard him in interview, and he'll talk about the ice magic a little bit. But he's certainly very interesting, and he's magically, or in terms of the occult world, he's done a lot. That's for sure. So
and I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, certainly his book Sigil Magic was like really big at the time.
Practical sigil magic. But I was shocked when I was in Germany. It's like, I think he's a way bigger deal there, just because he's written like 20 books or something over there that haven't been translated, and they're fairly ubiquitous. And I believe he's a member of the Fraternitas Saturni and all this other stuff. But what my kind of secondhand take on it was that he apparently got involved in the orbit of some type of guru figure, and then just people went over to learn from this guy, and it turned into a cult situation really quickly. And then apparently there was some like Nazi thing going on underneath the surface. Like they were kind of like, they were connected with German right-wing groups. This is all secondhand. I have no idea. This is all alleged because I literally have no idea. So.
Yeah. Well, one or two members of the group were, and I wouldn't say, I'm not going to say Nazi-ish, but definitely, let's say, a traditionalist with a capital T. But, and I think that was very much in keeping with this sort of like, it's the end of an era, the end of the aeon, Ragnarok is upon us, this sort of aesthetic. But I don't know if that's true. It might be true, but it might also be that it was kind of exploiting exaggerating, certain tendencies of people within the IoT who are favorable to it from the English branch. So I'm not really sure if that's true or not. But so I can tell you that the people that went out there definitely had the experience. Told me that it was a sort of guru. I mean, they described it as like brainwashing. But I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't have any first-hand knowledge of it.
And who exactly? So there was, if I'm correct, in that there was some type of guru figure that Frater VD had got.
Some kind of martial artist.
So who was this guy? That's never been talked about.
Yeah, I think his name is public, but I forget what it is actually.
But who was he like? Just kind of like a paranoid schizophrenic person? Was he? What was his deal?
I don't know. And I'm not sure if there was anything real behind it or not. I know that the Frater UD's book on Ice Magic is going to be released by Theon Books at some point, I think next year. So,
that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm definitely going to buy it. I want to see what it was all about. But
and what was Ice Magic? I mean, it sounds like something from a video game. It sounds like like ridiculous and juvenile, but clearly people were like taken by it. Like, I mean, not that chaos magic doesn't sound silly or magic period, but clearly people were just fixated on it as if it was like the next big thing. And so what exactly was it? Or what claims were people making?
Yeah, so I don't really know. The only thing that was said to me was the people that went out there to study, they were made to do lots of really bizarre exercises, like pressing your thumb and index finger together very gently for sort of like hours on end, and this kind of thing, and just really weird things that didn't really seem to be anything to do with magic. It seemed to be more to do with sort of mental control or something like that. But they described it as, you know, brainwashing. I don't know how true that is, obviously. So, but yeah, I mean, I believe this isn't something I knew at the time. I think I actually heard Frada UD mention this, but I could be wrong. But I think I heard him mention that it came from the ice rune. So I think there may be some sort of like northern sort of association with it, but that doesn't necessarily make it Nazi-ish. I mean,
right.
Frada UD is certainly very left-wing, if anything. So
yeah, he just seems kind of like a affable, you know, left-wing boomer.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and you know, I really don't think at the time he would have involved himself with anything right-wing. I mean, I could be wrong, but it didn't seem to be in keeping with what he was doing at that time. So I would be surprised.
So what was the war component? I mean, like, I remember reading in one of Peter Carroll's books, he's writing something about like going over there with his best magic dagger in his rucksack, and he called my first book not, you know, a sow's ear made out of a silk purse of chaos magic or something like that. He referred to, he referred to the people in my first book and myself as permanently deranged. He was like, this isn't chaos magic, this is permanent derangement. And I loved that. So if he's listening, thank you. That's like the best endorsement ever.
Oh boy.
Permanent. I am permanently deranged. So anyways, wow. What was that? What was that all about?
So I didn't really, I mean, I think when they actually physically, you know, met in Austria, so, you know, some British members had gone out there, but I think that was before I joined, I think. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think it was while I was a member, actually. But yeah, so I don't really know about all that kind of practical stuff. It was a little bit hush-hush. So.
Well, maybe there's a broader conversation to be had here, because there's something about magical groups that they quite often end up like this. Obviously, there's clear parallels with the fall of the Isis Urania Temple of the Golden Dawn with Crowley, and that sounded ridiculous as well. Like Crowley is showing up with a mask on in a full Scottish, you know, kit, and it's just like ridiculousness. So I think a more interesting question than why does that happen? Because I mean, like, look, magical orders can be, I think, in my opinion, can be very important for some people, particularly when they're young, when they're trying to, you know, find their identity, early 20s.
Yeah.
You know, it's like they really do accelerate people's progress, but it's maybe not so much from any magical system, but the fact that you're just around so many intensely focused and creative people. And so, you know, and clearly, you know, like Temple of Psychic Youth fell apart in the 1990 or whenever it was. And it just seems to, you know, these groups seem to run their course. There's a broader question there, though, which is, you know, for most of the people listening to this have never and probably will never have experience of magical orders, which is fine. But I envy that sometimes. But because I can't get those years back. But you know, it's now, you know, what, 20, 30 years later, it's like, and going through life, you know, how do you see, like, the concept of initiation, right? It's like, how do you see initiation as a process and as a thing now versus being in a magical group where you're just being given titles and going through rituals, and it's kind of this performative thing?
Yeah, good question. Well, just touching upon something that you said a minute ago before that. In the temple I belong to, I think there were 8 of us. There may have been, I think there were 8, and one of them was not particularly active, just for a few months. And I think 7 of us, two were well-known avant-garde musicians, and I think the 4 of us became authors, and the other person was a translator of a well-known book on sigil magic. So So, when you think about that, that's kind of remarkable, right? You get 8 people together and 7 of them do something interesting, whether that's becoming an author or a musician or something like that. And I think that was, very much like the Golden Dawn as well, that you had these really interesting, creative individuals involved in the original Golden Dawn. And whether it's like that today, I'm sort of
Probably
not. Have my suspicions. So yeah, I think these things do kind of come and go, and there's only a moment for them, really. I would doubt that the IoT is really reflective of now of what it was 30 years ago, when you did have these sort of really interesting, creative people. And I think it being before the internet as well. It's sort of guaranteed that you would only really get interesting people, because you had to find out about that group, which meant you had to find out about an occult bookshop, then you had to read through occult publications, and then you had to write to them, write to an order, and then wait until you got a response, and then maybe you would get an invitation to go and see them. And it could be a year-long process just to join an order, whereas now it's probably a couple of months max, and you probably get an email back a couple of days later. And I think that the fact that it was just much harder to find meant that the people involved in these things were generally much more interesting. And people think of the IoT and the OTO and the Golden Dawn as sort of huge, and you can buy books about them in most occult bookshops all over the Western world. But at the same time, the membership is very small of these organizations. I mean, I would doubt that the IoT had a membership of more than about 25 people when I was in it. Probably less than that.
It was significantly larger when I was in it, but
oh really?
But because it had become international, but it was still not big. It was still not big.
Yeah. Well, actually, there was a group in California as well, so that might have doubled the size. But
I think that was Doug Grant. I think that was Doug Grant, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, what is initiation as opposed to being involved with a magical group? Well, yeah, good question. So yeah, well, initiation, of course, it usually involves a ritual, or let's say traditionally involves some kind of ritual of initiation. And very often, of course, that's been an initiation into, manhood or womanhood, and mysteries associated with being a man or a woman. Has been a part of that, if not a substantial part of the initiation. So for example, the Maasai tribe of Africa will put their sort of boys who are becoming men through an initiation of circumcision without any sort of anesthetic, but then they will wear particular clothes after that and whiten their faces as if they are ghosts and this kind of thing.
Yeah, just to interject, a guy who used to work for me, who grew up in the Philippines, said they do that as well, and he did it. And they hold them down and do circumcision without anesthetic. But the catch is, if you flinch or cry out even once, you are permanently shamed by the culture. There's no way to take it back.
Yeah, that's right. That's the same with the Maasai as well. You mustn't cry out in pain at all. And there have been other, similarly brutal initiations. Julius Caesar writes about the initiation of the Gauls, the young men of the Gaul tribes in Western Europe. And he said that they would put the aurochs, or sort of very large bisons, well, he says only slightly smaller than an elephant, but very large bisons into a pit, and then the young men would have to go in and kill the bisons, and obviously many of them were killed in the process.
Wow.
But yeah, and I think that probably the most interesting ritual when we're talking about these sort of violent initiations of young men is there was a ritual among the Spartans, and it was held every year, and the sort of boys who were becoming men would have to go and steal cheeses from an altar at a particular temple. And while they were stealing the cheeses, they would be whipped, and some of them would be whipped so hard that they would end up dying of their wounds. But their parents would sort of egg them on, will them on to steal the cheeses. And I think there's kind of a couple of interesting things about that. One is your parents sort of willing you on to endure this sort of pain and suffering. which is just about the opposite of what we see today, of course. And the other
Yeah,
thing is
that's
the
interesting.
idea.
I hadn't thought about that. That is interesting. That
Yeah, well,
it's so opposed to how I guess parenting is now.
oh yeah, definitely. And in our culture as a whole, which is all about, protecting people and, were you hurt by that word and words of violence and this kind of thing. Well, not really. But and I think the other thing is, usually in a temple, there's an altar and you lay a sacrifice on it. You would sacrifice the cheese to the goddess or the wine or the corn or whatever it may be. But here they're stealing it from the altar. And in a way, it's almost as if the god wants you to sort of defy them and steal from him or her, and to become this person of sort of ferocity who in a sense will embody that power and become sort of godlike in themselves. And I think, in a certain sense, initiation is becoming godlike. And I don't mean that in a sort of narcissistic sense where, you become egotistical and say that you are perfect when you're not, or you become incredibly vain. Definitely the opposite of that. Rather, by becoming godlike, I mean, someone who isn't necessarily concerned by all of the foolishness of the contemporary age or the age they live in, or the sort of fashions of the day, but really are rooted in the idea of there being something transcendent and trying to sort of embody that transcendent ideal. But obviously among, Spartan young men, it was, becoming strong and fierce and a warrior and brave and facing death were were ways in which they would do that. Of course, there may be other ways. But so in a sense, becoming being initiated is this setting you on a path to where you kind of embody the sacred, and in a sense that is embodying the archetypal, right? So, if you're, I'm not saying that one should not, one should be sort of copying stereotypes at all, but the idea is, of course, to become more archetypal, right? So. As a man, you want to be strong, fierce. You want to be intelligent as well. But certainly, if you look in mythology, you find that the men are sort of fierce and warriors and fighting the dragon, whereas the woman is the sort of the psychic, the sorceress, the one who speaks with the female deities to smooth the oceans, to make their passage to this other world safer, or whatever it may be. And that's these two figures kind of work together. So there are archetypes, and I think the initiation is becoming that archetype. Of course, there is the shaman who may be a man who dresses in a woman's body, and by becoming both male and female, embodies nature and transgresses against it, and thus has sort of supernatural powers because he or she is somewhere between the material world and the gods. But that's a sort of more specialist initiation. Most people were not shamans. That's a minority, a tiny minority. And that would be a type of initiation, and that would be an initiation. But for most people, it would be sort of more embodying the sort of archetypal, male or female. But so, as opposed to being in a magical order, that's a good question, because of course there are initiations in magical orders. I don't know if at the time when you were in the IoT whether there was a set type of initiation.
There never was. I ran initiations for tons of people, and because I was holding Magister Templi, and we always customized it to the actual person. Right. There was no like Masonic thing. It was, we got to know somebody. We, had a sense of who they were and where their psychological blocks were. Right. And then the initiation would usually involve some type of confrontation with what was holding them back. That I think is very rare to have that. Very personal in a way. I don't think that type of thing could maybe even be possible now, because it's such a different cultural climate, and people are so, on edge about everything all the time.
That's right. Yeah, definitely. Well, I think, to have someone confront their inner weaknesses or their demons, would probably lead to charges of
It could.
abuse.
Yeah, it could. And so I don't envy anyone trying to do that type of thing. Now, maybe it's a lost thing, or maybe it just becomes occulted again.
Yes.
But yeah, it's interesting. You're talking about like initiation into young adulthood and some of these brutal initiations. It made me think of street gangs. Where the initiation there can be anything, getting jumped in, where it's like everyone stands around you and beats the hell out of you, which is basically, similar, I suppose, or to, having to, in more extreme circumstances, having to kill somebody or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
That's
right.
It also but it's interesting that you kind of make a differentiation between types of initiation, which I want to kind of look at. I mean, there's lots of ones that came up. But the first one that you point out is kind of the difference between the initiation into adulthood and initiation into shamanism or magic, which is totally different, very rare. Although luckily now people have invented festivals, so everyone who goes to a festival and does ketamine can be a shaman. So they sorted that one out. But in reality, even within magical orders, people who are actually, I would say, capital S magicians or shamans is very low. Most people are kind of playing the kind of social game. This kind of like, I'll pretend you have magic powers if you pretend I have magical powers, which is just a total. Is a non-starter. But I remember even you even read about Crowley being in the Golden Dawn, and he was interested in Mathers as this kind of larger than life ego or father figure, maybe patterning his adult persona after this person. But it seemed like there was only one person, at least available to Crowley, that was actually doing magic, who was Alan Bennett, who is a fascinating individual who ended up becoming the person that brought Buddhism to England, and that's where Crowley actually did his learning. But it wouldn't have been possible to find that person outside of a magical order. But I think that making the point that initiation into a magical order in no way whatsoever guarantees some type of supernatural benefit or becoming a shaman. I mean, I really do think that it's you kind of have to be born that way.
For sure. And obviously with shamans and also with someone who becomes a Sufi master as well, often these initiations begin in dreams, or with shamans with, some kind of sickness as well. And, it's interesting. I wrote about this in, I think in my last book, that, if you look at a lot of very famous people, or if you look at people who are genuinely sort of master their field, they often have periods in their childhood either of extreme poverty or extreme illness where they nearly die. And it's almost like a sort of a shamanic initiation is pushing these people to become creative individuals, whether that's creative in the world of fine art or in acting or being an author or whatever it may be. So, I can definitely see from that, that sort of experience in a tribal setting is going to push you into being some kind of shaman type figure, but it's definitely unusual for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that, life is an initiator, and life will initiate you whether you like it or not. And I think, and that's a mysterious process, and it's different but I think that one of the things about going through a magical order is you're kind of signaling that you want to go through that process.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Life is kind of brutal. It's going to end in death. You have to face, sickness or poverty or, your loved one dying or whatever it may be. But those things somehow initiate you, right? If you have the right frame of mind. And, I think up until relatively recently, most people had the right frame of mind, that they understood that life was brutal and short, and they could, whether the religion was good or not, they at least had some sense of the sacred, and there was something beyond this world. So, that it wasn't just this sort of misery. They could kind of transcend it in a way. But I think increasingly over the last 2 decades, there's a kind of anti-initiatic mindset where, we mustn't let anybody experience any kind of suffering at all. And suffering is in the mind, of course, right? So, I mean, there are people who have horrible things happen but don't suffer, and other people who have, live very comfortable and spoiled lives who are suffering terribly emotionally because they just don't know how to cope with the slightest little thing, and there's always going to be something that's not quite right. So
I've met several people who've just gone through unbelievable abuse as children, and not like somebody said a word. I mean, just like the type of stuff that turns your hair white. And yet they're totally positive, wonderful people. I mean, it's like that really is interest. That maybe there's an initiatory message there in a way, in the sense, only in the sense that life is what you make it. It's like you're going to go through extreme experiences one way or the other. You can't hide from life, but you do have control over how you interpret and react to things. And it's fascinating how one person can go through, a traumatic event, and what it means to them is the world is awful. The world is, it is evil. That there's no hope. And another person can go through the same or similar event, and the meaning they take out of it is that they can help people who've gone through the same thing, or life is so precious because it's so short, or a new appreciation for non-traumatic experience. And that's totally in the mind of the person, and I'm not one of these new age people that says you create your own experiences, and if you go through something bad, it's because you manifested it. So, I think that's silly, but you do always have control over your reactions to things.
Yeah, definitely. And, and even further than that, not only do some people who have, terrible upbringings, turn out to be wonderful people who are very positive in their, approach to life, but, some people who make life as comfortable as they can for themselves and never take risks and really have a pretty easy life by most people's standards, end up becoming extremely resentful and angry. And, and it's, you can see the anger today among affluent young people.
Yeah.
I'm sure most of them do not appear to be the type of people who had a tough upbringing. So.
No. And I it's such an interesting comment that you made, that it's kind of like a counter or anti-initiatory thing, where it's like, I don't know. Like, I feel like if you haven't been through hardship, you almost have to create it for yourself to go through it.
Yeah, that's right.
And if there's no hardship in the environment, then, you're going to decide that somebody said a word to you or something like that.
Yeah.
But the resentment, the level of resentment, now it goes beyond talking about cancel culture or something like that. I mean, the level of just palpable resentment in people right now is... Maybe it's just getting older, but it feels, like in the 80s and 90s, people were like counterculture and against the system and all this, but they didn't have this like just pure bitter resentment at life that seems to be so common now. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or particularly in relation to this idea of having to, the initiation into adulthood that people are not undergoing, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. Well, your comment about, if you don't suffer, you kind of have to create your own suffering, or at least you have to create your own sort of extremely challenging experience, right? And in a way, that is what initiatic orders do, whether it's a chaos magic order if it's doing it properly, or Freemasonry, or some kind of initiatic group from in a tribe somewhere. They create some traumatic experience, right? Or at least, even in Freemasonry, at least symbolically, right? A lot of people would find that kind of frightening, especially today. Or and even if you go and think about subcultures as well, why do people keep getting more tattoos? They kind of get addicted to that pain, right? Having to control the pain of being tattooed. And that becomes a kind of an initiatic experience. And, if you look at tattoo journals from 20 years ago. There's a lot about, sort of new age spirituality in there. It's all sort of intertwined in a way, because they are trying to create some kind of authentic kind of pagan or tribal initiation for the modern age. But sorry, what was the second question you had?
What was it? Oh, just kind of talking about the resentment and bitterness and and yet at the same time, like even within my lived lifetime, the quality of human existence has like improved so much in so many fundamental ways. I mean, there's lots that's falling apart. There's tons that is wrong with the world. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's like, I see that too, but it's like, if you really take a step back, it's like, we live in the golden age. It's like we live in a time of magic, literally, where through technology, where anything that you want to do, you can, it's not going to be given to you, but you have the resources to educate yourself and find it. And it's, life is phenomenal right now. And yet people are just, it's tough to see I'm obviously not discounting people's lived experiences. I wouldn't do that, but it's tough to like travel in a place like India where you're seeing infants die on the ground, and then you come back here and people are miserable because they didn't get their car got scratched or something like that, or I don't know. That's tough.
That's right. And you mentioned about the subculture of the previous century, and I think what has definitely happened over the last, say, 15 years, maybe 20 years, which is totally the opposite of subculture prior to that. People knew, and someone who's involved in all sorts of subcultures. If you dress differently, if you kind of shook a fist at the system and showed that you were against it because you were a punk or a goth or whatever it was, or a hippie, you knew you were going to get threatened with physical violence all the time,
and you might be killed. You
might be killed. That definitely.
Particularly in America and the South,
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, even in England, it was pretty bad as well. I didn't see anyone killed, but definitely there was a lot of experiences with people being threatened with broken bottles or with knives, and this was a very regular occurrence. And and I think but the difference in a way was, well, first of all, it kind of maybe it toughened you up a little bit, but also it was, no one thought that society should accept them. Maybe people thought they shouldn't be threatened with violence, I'm sure, but they also felt like, sure, I am against society, and no one would think, well, and society should respect me, and my society should say that I'm a good guy and I'm doing the right thing and try and support me. You kind of knew, right, that no, I'm giving the middle finger to society, so society is not going to like me. Whereas today, I feel like people rebel against society and then get upset when they don't get society's approval. And it's kind of, you can't really have it both ways. And if you're going to be weird and different, I think that that's fine and that's cool, but you can't expect mainstream society to support you, really, because you're rebelling against that.
Right. Yeah, well, one of the things about, and I certainly went through that, where it's funny you say that, because I mean, I did have that reaction where a little bit, not consciously, it's kind of embarrassing to talk about, but I was like, I did go as far out as possible off the deep end. And then I was like, why does no one care? Even now, it's like I talk about magic and, for a few thousand people, and hopefully those people get something out of it. But it's not like I'm on Oprah, maybe someday.
No, yeah.
Yeah. But, but one of the things, one thing I want to talk about is, initiation just means to begin something. Sure. And we're kind of talking about the initiation into a young adulthood, but there's tons of initiations throughout life, and sometimes it could be like marriage or childbearing or the death of parents, or in some ways it could be initiation, something happens to you, like suffering perhaps, that now you understand what other people, you're initiated into that suffering that other people have experienced. I was watching an interview with Nick Cave last night, which was just great. And it was funny because somebody asked him, how do you rebel now as opposed to being a punk in the 80s? And he said, be conservative and go to church, which was pretty funny. And then he said, he tells people that he's religious, not spiritual, just to wind them up, which I thought was hilarious also.
Yeah.
But he said, very famously and very tragically, a few years ago, he lost his son. His 15-year-old son he's 15, and he was on acid, and he walked off a cliff with his friends without realizing it and died. And that's, I don't think there's maybe anything worse than children dying before their parents.
No,
it's nobody wants that. And he talks about, and he did 2 albums about it, which are at least 2 albums, which are just the, I think among the greatest art made in the last, possibly ever, with songwriting. It's just, they're almost too raw to listen to. But he kind of opened up to the world to express what he was going through. And he said that over time, people started writing him letters saying not necessarily commiserating, but saying, this happened to me. And in that, he was saying, it's like he came to understand humanity in a new way, in a completely new way, and respect humanity as before he was not very, as he was saying, more self-absorbed, and have this respect for the suffering that everyone goes through. And what he said that made me think of it in this context was that he felt that experience completed him as a person. And it's obviously nobody wants to go through that, but that he was speaking of it as if it was also an initiation. It's like that was his completion as a person. And what he meant by that, I can't guess at, but it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is true. Yeah. If we go through life, we do have these things which kind of initiate us into a new understanding, for sure, and a deeper one. And usually they're not always the nicest of experiences. I mean, I guess sometimes they are. I mean, sure, having a child must be, but yeah.
And that's kind of, I've gone through many times in my life periods where just literally everything's taken away from me, and then I end up in a completely different life with new people in my life with no reference points to the old life. I went through one recently, and those are initiations or crossings of abysses. And I think that I suspect that if I wasn't a magician, I probably would not go through that type of thing so intensely, or maybe not. I don't know, but there is something about engaging. I don't know. I want to watch what I say, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like life will tear you down and build you back up.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah. When you said that if you weren't a magician, maybe you wouldn't go through that, I was actually thinking that maybe you would, but maybe you wouldn't come out of it. That might be another way of looking at it, because most people experience some kind of tragedy at some point.
That's why I was saying, maybe I'm not choosing my words correctly. One thing that magic does do, though, is it gives you the ability to kind of create a mythological framework around what you're going through, which can be helpful.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, it gives you a different frame of reference, right? And it does turn you back to these myths of the underworld, or death, or heroic struggle against the dragon, or whatever it may be. But at least it brings you out of the sort of prison of the moment when things are going very, very wrong. And like you, I've definitely had experiences like that, many of them, especially being a foreigner for half my life almost.
In terms of coming to the US?
Yeah, the US, and I lived in Canada for 3 years as well, and they weren't always. There were some of those years were pretty tough, to say the least.
Was that where was that in Canada, by the way?
Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Oh, interesting.
Which is about 2.5 hours north of New York, and it's a very, very small town. I mean, technically, it's called a city, but anyone who's lived in New York or London would not regard it as a city. But I mean, it's very nice. It's just it's kind of difficult to live there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's interesting. I was like one of my most brutal initiatory periods involved losing everything and ending up in suburban Vancouver in Canada through a series of events. It's like made me think of that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we've been on a similar trajectory.
I think so. I mean, and there is something to be said there about the idea of a magical current. Is what we were engaged in the same one.
That's right. Yeah, and when you think about Crowley as well, it's sort of blown all over the world. Really, it wasn't at a time when people weren't really doing that as well. Weren't really. I mean, people definitely traveled more than we think, especially in antiquity. But it was that during Crowley's lifetime, travel wasn't that common, and certainly was very uncommon to go to all the places he went to. He even went to Canada as well, by the way. So
yeah, I mean,
he was in the middle.
Crowley, as always, is a fascinating case. And that he kind of patterned himself after Richard Burton and wanted the travel writer and wanted to kind of be that. And he really did live this huge, larger than life existence, and went through many times where he lost everything and was built back up a lot.
Yeah.
And he's. What can you say about that? But there definitely does seem to be something about the magical current. I mean, like I've definitely, I can't count how many people I've been and how many places I've lived. And it wasn't like necessarily as dramatic as, walking through Tunisia in a robe or something like that, like with Crowley. But, it's just like I've lost track of how many people I've been. And it's been interesting for me. I was talking about this with Carl Abramson. I mean, it's like, moving out of cities and kind of going through this kind of period of, we went through lockdown where you can't go out. And then I've kind of, I like that actually. It's like not of it, someone's forcing it on me, but, I've kind of been in that mode permanently, and, I've moved and I'm putting my life back together, and I'm kind of getting a chance to think back and try to begin correlating all the people that I've been.
Right.
And
totally.
And it's interesting. It's like there's never been like I've never made like a full accounting of how does this all add up, so this is interesting. Trying to assemble some type of master personality out of it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's definitely been similar for me. But I think, some of the more interesting people in history, and maybe the sort of great people or people who break some kind of boundary, whether it's large or small, are often very contradictory. I think part of life is trying to resolve those contradictions, or maybe trying to resolve them gives you a kind of energy, a kind of forward momentum, which might be what you need to go through these experiences and come out the other side.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about quote unquote initiation in a magical sense is, Crowley talks about this a lot, that you're trying to get as much of an experience of the universe and human life as possible. You're trying to experience everything, and you can't experience everything as a stable personality. I don't mean stable as like an unstable person. I mean, if you change your personality or careers or focus or relationships, or you travel a lot is usually the best way to do it. Then you get to experience life through many more angles and positions. And if you're just shuttered into one identity that you're trying with all of your might to prop up and defend against the world, like so many people seem to be doing now, then you're shutting yourself off from expansion.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And I think especially in our time, which is a time of rapid change, that's probably incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. I if anything, I really am very grateful for going through, the chaos current, et cetera, because it prepared me for dealing with life as it is now. It's like, it's like when things happen and it's like, oh, you have to give up everything and stay in lockdown. It's like, I'm not saying that's easy for me, but I have contact. Like, for me, shedding a personality and developing a new one is a practice thing.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, So do you have, let's go back to the idea of counter initiation, because you talked about anti-initiatory attitude. And I thought that was such an interesting comment that I want to spend more time on it. It immediately made me think of Rene Guénon.
Right.
Talking about the counter initiation. There's kind of like this current in society that pretends to be initiatory, pretends to be rebellious perhaps, but is really just kind of dragging people, is splitting people apart, dragging them down into making them less integrated as people ultimately, and ending in chaos, as opposed to some type of true initiation, which should develop a whole human being. And I thought that was a pretty shocking book for me to read. So anyways, that's kind of the context I was thinking about your comment in, but maybe say more about what you were thinking there.
Yeah. Well, it was just this idea of, initiation really, well, partly preparing us for life, but also turning our minds towards what is beyond the material world, towards the eternal and the sacred, and maybe what is recurring throughout the millennia. But I think unfortunately there is a very sort of counter-initiatic or anti-initiatic attitude in our day and age. That no one must experience anything that makes them uncomfortable, and I think even we could just say that seems to be the prevailing sentiment of the contemporary West. That no one must experience anything that makes them uncomfortable, even if it is a word. And initiation is fundamentally, at the very least, being uncomfortable. It's about being put in some kind of entirely alien, foreign environment that is, or that is very often sort of threatening or dark, or would seem plausibly to lead to some bad end. Even whether it's having somebody holding a ritual dagger to your chest or something like that, and you're wondering who this person is, and the dark room you're in. It can be obviously very intimidating, but experiencing the unknown, and experiencing one's mortality, and experiencing something that seems kind of threatening. In the case of the Maasai, is actually, and a similar tribe is can be very literally physically extremely painful, or mentally challenging. It's the exact opposite mindset of we can't possibly ask someone to read this, say, classic book on their master's degree, because it has a word in it that might upset them. And we must make sure that everybody is comfortable. And I think, obviously partly that is because, everybody is a client, everybody is a customer. Education is very expensive. So, universities want to do this for many reasons, of course, but one clearly is that the students are customers, and if our customers say they don't want to read this book, we can't really make them, because we're going to get them $100,000 in debt by the end of it. So that's certainly one thing, but it's also seeped into the broader world as well, that we can't possibly expect anybody to experience anything that would make them uncomfortable. But life for the last 500,000 years of human beings has been entirely uncomfortable. But because of that, people did look to the sacred and had hope in the future and had hope in something beyond this world.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think also, even before, college, it's like kids now are raised in this totally different way, in this like sterilized, sanitized environment where all their information is monitored. They're driven around in these kind of like large SUVs that are like tanks. And I understand, because the reality is like the world is very dangerous, or America is very dangerous for children. You know, it's like school shootings could happen. It's like, it's not like there's things that kids need to be protected from, or that there's not things that they need to be protected from. It's like the world is actually very dangerous in some ways now, but you know, which is a shame. You know, but I think back and it's like, even growing up, 30 years ago, whatever, we were constantly getting into trouble. Our kids would go out and play and hurt themselves and get into fights. Yeah. And then when you're a teenager, you're just, doing drugs and getting into terrible situations and experimenting in all these ways. And without that, I feel like you're not prepared for life. And then you get to university and, somebody said a word. And it's like, it's so unhealthy. I mean, even when I think about throughout my life, every time that I've gone through something awful, I've come out stronger on the other end. And it's not just that's not just in theory, it's not just like suffering makes you strong, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's like when you go through, when you experience things like that, you develop antibodies to it, and you know how to handle it, and you can coach and guide other people who are going through it. But if you never have the experience, then everyone just has a wide open immune system.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And, I guess in the past, let's say 500 years ago, just to pick a time, I guess you could have an initiation that wasn't going through this sort of chaos, where you joined a crafts guild, and then you followed the example of the other workers and the master, and your dad taught you how to drink beer properly and how to, speak to women or whatever it was. But, in this day and age of ours, in which there's extremely rapid change and it's a much more chaotic environment, and we barely have a nuclear family, and you don't know the names of your neighbors.
Right. One second. One second. I've got a crying dog. I'll be right back.
No worries.
Yeah. Sorry. Speaking of suffering and child rearing, it's like my dog just looks at his toy box crying, like it's the end of the world until I go get his toys for him. So no sorry. You were talking about the nuclear family and so forth.
Yeah, and I'm sure 500 years ago you could have an initiation without all this chaos and drug taking, and because there were examples, and vocations lasted a lifetime. You think about the building of the cathedrals; they took several generations to build. So you could start when you were 14 or 15 or younger, maybe 12, whatever it was, and then die at 50, and it still wouldn't be finished. But you could as a young person, you could learn from the other men of the village or the other women of the village. What were they doing in their crafts or guilds or skill, and how did they treat other people, and what did they think of life? So you had this sort of examples to live by. Well, I'm sure they weren't all good, but some of them would have been. But today, in our our day and age of rapid change, where whole industries are decimated and new industries appear and new technology we've never heard of, and this constant change, and maybe this sort of slightly dubious form of initiation of taking drugs when you're young and doing crazy things, and I'm certainly not endorsing it, but maybe it does, as bad as it is, it kind of does provide you with those antibodies, as you say, for a world that is seemingly more and more strange and chaotic.
Yeah, that's interesting, the comment about drugs. I mean, I think that obviously I'm not endorsing it either, and it's not the ideal way to do anything. But I just, as the broader point, that I think young people, if they don't have access to some initiatory structure, will find or make one, and usually that's in very crude ways. Yeah, I don't know. I for the longest time, I kind of like didn't get wrapped up in the whole like dialogue around cancel culture or
Right.
anything like that, because I thought a lot of it was just exaggeration by the right wing, but
Right.
it's really not.
Yeah. No, it's unfortunate, and recently, actually today, I saw a left wing female presenter is being attacked because she's not sufficiently on board with the latest issue, and it's like, and she's been around for like 20 years as well, and it's kind of crazy that this would happen. I mean, it's obviously very much reminiscent of Christianity when people would argue, about something ridiculous. I don't know if people really argued about how many angels you could get on the head of a pin, but it is that kind of purity spiral, obviously, and that kind of religious commitment to it. But people should be whatever they want to be, obviously. But I think the strange thing is today that people become something, and they seem to be unhappy with the world as a result, whether that's their sexuality or they become involved in some subculture. And for example, paganism. I saw someone recently posting online, they've been a pagan for 3 weeks or whatever, and they're posting online that they've been oppressed for 2,000 years by Christianity. And
well, that's nothing new. People used to do that all the time also.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that was a new thing. Okay.
No, not
maybe
a
it's
new
not
thing.
so new.
That people would get into read a book on witchcraft at the mall and then say like, we are the descendants of the witches you couldn't burn or something like that.
Oh, right.
The burning times.
But bringing this back to initiation, I think one thing that's kind of interesting is that there's no sense of sort of ecstasy or transcendence. There's no sort of nothing ecstatic about it. I mean, at least if you look back at the sort of acid house days, people were trying to have these ecstatic experiences, or the hippies were trying to have these sort of transcendental experiences with LSD. Maybe goths were in their own way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that sort of ecstatic experience seems to have completely filtered out of Western society, and in a sense, that's a very Protestant attitude, right? The Catholics had this idea, the glory of rising after death, and but the Protestants focused on the cross itself, just sort of nothing after. I mean, yes, technically there was something after the cross, but it was focused very much on the sort of dying. It wasn't so much on the resurrection, and sort of sackcloth and ashes, and sort of not really stoic, but sort of slightly depressed. Maybe it went with the grey weather of these Protestant countries. I don't know, but there was no sort of ecstasy with it. It was all kind of very, not morbid, but very, I don't know, matter of fact in a way.
Yeah. Well, also, go ahead.
Sorry. Whereas at least with Catholicism, you can see these sort of wild parades where they're holding up Madonna and she's like covered in, a couple of hundred flowers or whatever. And it's all very, colorful and sort of wild in a way. And obviously if you go back to pagan times, it's, Bacchic revels and this kind of thing. And, shamans wanting to experience some kind of, ecstatic trance or whatever. But, with Protestantism, you do get this focus on, the cross, the kind of misery, the woe. And, that seems to be very much our society today, which, as much as, people say that they are not Christian, they've absolutely adopted the kind of empty shell that Christianity has left behind and kind of fit themselves into it. So.
Absolutely. And I think that, people have I really feel about, the current cultural moment, people have replicated all of the worst parts of Christianity and completely discarded the best ones. Because as much, heat as Christianity comes under, it's like, it's also it can be a very profoundly maturing thing and maturing religion. I don't mean like crazy evangelical megachurches, but, a kind of initiatory experience into what is meant by the figure of Christ, what is meant by suffering undertaken for others, taking it seriously. But, it's like the culture now, like, it has all these elements of judging your neighbors, or the people in the other church, or people who are not part of your church, or, crusading against people, or witch burning. It has all of that, but it doesn't have mercy or forgiveness at all. And what is that? I mean, you can't have life, you cannot have human existence without mercy or forgiveness, because we all make sometimes terrible mistakes. It's like you have to. Or we just do something when we're in a bad state where we're really stressed out or something, and then it's everyone goes through that, and the basis of compassion is understanding that other people suffered just as much as you or more. And
that's right.
There's none of that now. There's no forgiveness, and I think that is unbelievable. I mean, people used to talk about evangelical Christianity, and certainly in the 90s and things like that, it was seen as the enemy and all of that. And living in Texas, it's like evangelicals are they're something else. But I think that this thing that's I'm afraid just getting started, this kind of like this destruction of everything. It reminds me of like the iconoclast or something like that. There's a destruction and tearing down of everything beautiful in the name of some purity spiral. I think that we haven't even begun to understand how bad that is, how it will have a chilling effect on art. It will make people unhealthy. It will make people's because it's like we're living in the midst of this unbelievable material prosperity, yet everyone's miserable, and not everyone, but it's like people have been given information technology, and they've just used it to find new ways to be unimaginably cruel to each other. And it is a religion. I think it's a religion of cruelty, and it is a religion.
Yeah, I think, in regard to art, I think, that is something that's different, right? Because, during the 80s, maybe probably even well into the 90s as well, you could make art that was completely against the system and that would upset people. And you could definitely make art that upset Christians. You should see some of my art from that period. But, and okay, people might tart, but that was the end of it, right? It wasn't like you were going to lose your job for it or anything like that. Whereas now, I think you'd have to be absolutely crazy to make art that really went against the prevailing sentiments of the time. It would be...
And that's terrible. I mean, that means artists can't do their job.
They cannot. No, that's right.
All that you can do, I suppose, is make the equivalent of like bland corporate art to put on an office wall. That's And art.
And I think that's so ironic, right? Because it's all, well, not always, but for the vast majority of the time, it's been the sort of radical left that made all the art. And now it's that side who says, oh, you can't make art because that, you will have offended someone.
It's horrible. And people are not able to be educated anymore. And
no, that's right. That's right.
I think we're just, I mean, hopefully it passes, but I don't know. I mean, if you look at history, yes, things come and go, but sometimes they can take several hundred years to go. And
that's right.
Well,
I think one of the interesting things about the West is we get hysterical about something for about 10 or 15 years, and then it's completely forgotten, as if it never happened.
Right.
So, I mean, I would say that whatever we're hysterical about today, we won't even remember 15 years from now, but we might be as hysterical about something else, which will be, weird. Probable.
It's just like it's this giant flood of the crowd is like this giant flood of locusts that will go from one thing to the next, to devour and destroy, and then they're distracted by something else and they go over there. I mean, it's interesting too. I mean, talking about that in the context of chaos magic and things like that, I think that the thing that makes people vulnerable now is having a static identity. And, if you have a static identity on the internet, then people can attack it. But If
Yeah.
you're anonymous, then they can't. And so I think that people getting attached to building these online brands, like every person, you can't just be a human anymore. You have to be a brand, even starting from when you're like 7. That has made people crazy. People should not have to bear that burden. And it's a mistake.
That's right. Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah. But I'm actually spending a lot less time on the internet, just because for me, it feels like it's become like TV, maybe like public access TV of 30 years ago. It's really a lot less interesting than it was 15, 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
Now. So
yeah, I mean, I feel like most of the internet now seems to be written by outsourced people in other countries.
Yeah.
So it's just like everything is clickbait. You can't. It's very hard. Google.
That's right.
Google just turns up the equivalent of junk mail now.
Yeah, that's right. And even today, and I listen to all kinds of things that are very. If you saw what I listened to, you find it was all completely contradictory, because I'm not listening to just one side and believing it. But I was listening. I just did a search for rune magic today on YouTube just to see what came up, and all the top videos are kind of attractive 22-year-old women, which is okay, fine, but forget the fact that they're women. It's like no one is an expert at 22 in anything, and but of course, an attractive 22-year-old woman is going to get more likes and shares, especially when it's presented in a very sort of friendly way of like, well, you can just do some rune magic and it's really easy and you can learn these signs, and they don't have this sort of deep mystery to them, really, and nothing controversial. And so it's all this sort of whatever is the most sort of not family friendly, but so maybe vanity friendly, where you can just dip into things and it's all very light and the people are attractive, which is a bit like, adverts for Coca-Cola or something like that in a way, right? You get the most attractive people. It's all very light. It's going to make you happy. There's no downside, nothing controversial. So it's kind of, yeah. So it's becoming very much like TV. I think I feel like you could have these people on TV, honestly, and the same with their opinions. They're not going to say anything controversial. They're not going to, they haven't read philosophy for 10 years and they haven't read deeply into religion or anything. So, or come to their own opinions. No 22-year-old has come to their own opinions.
Yeah, I think that for me underlines how important books are. And I've been thinking about this more now more than ever, because for a while I'd kind of fallen into this idea of, books are kind of going away. That sucks. But, at the same time, we can hoard PDFs and all of that. But the things are so noxious right now in terms of culture. I mean, you probably saw this. They're re-editing Roald Dahl's books. They're re-editing the James Bond books to change them. It's like, you can't do that. I don't understand why people accept that. If you want a different book, write a new one. Don't destroy something that is. Don't re-edit the work of an author who's now dead, so that you can't get the original. I mean, even Crowley has been re-edited and sanitized over time, which most people are not aware of. But then it's like, well, you can't do that, and I think that that's why I'm thinking it's like, hang on to your books. Because they're going to be useful. They're going to be important, including old textbooks, before things were sanitized for political reasons. Because it might be the only way to maintain any connection with the truth, particularly now, because going forward, I don't know if you've played with ChatGPT and all that.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, it just seems clear to me, from now on, everything's going to be written by that.
Yes, that's right.
Even authors who are putting their names on it are also going to be using it. And there's
definitely,
the good thing about it is it's a more effective form of search than Google. But it's like we may be at this point where between that and cancellation and sensitivity readers, every major publisher has a sensitivity reader now to sanitize something before it's out. And it's like self-censorship is the worst censorship. So
that's right. Definitely.
We're going off a cliff with all that. So it's just like, keep buying books, keep hoarding them, particularly older ones, before people had to keep, before the book burning squad came.
Yeah, that's right. Definitely. Yeah, it is remarkable.
Yeah. What did you think of ChatGPT when you were taking a look at it?
Yeah, so I've looked at both ChatGPT and Google's Bard, and you actually get quite different results. But uh, yeah, I mean, they produce really remarkable, pretty generic content. But when you think about it, remarkable generic content is pretty much what most people want.
Mm.
So, I mean, what's TV if it's not, sort of remarkable generic content, it's
Mm.
all the kind of same stuff, right? The same opinions, the same everything. But yeah, so and actually, I edit a couple of magazines, and I was sent an article written by ChatGPT a few weeks ago, and I would say the article was total rubbish, actually.
Mm.
But what's so troubling is that the a person who is intelligent enough to write an article actually thought that that was a good enough article to send me, and it kind of tells me that although these programs are predicted to reach a sort of a general intelligence level in a couple of years, so that we won't know that we're talking to a computer. It will think we're talking to human beings. But even if that doesn't happen, I would say that they're good enough to fool 80%, 90% of the population already. Yeah.
The problem is, though, they're full of lies. I mean, it's like,
yeah,
even like I've been using GPT to assist in coding, and even with something as black and white, or somewhat black and white, as computer code, that you think that that would be what an AI would be best at, it will just, I mean, the AI term for it is hallucinating. I mean, it will just wholesale make shit up, even for computer code that doesn't work, that is not nonsensical. And it might be slipping up subtly so that, you get down a road 3 hours later and you realize it's led you down this pathway. You've thought it's been walking you through doing something, but you realize it's walking you towards this hallucinated thing that isn't real, and doesn't work.
Wow.
And I saw a tweet today from an old colleague, journalistic colleague, who was saying that, in like what this means for it's the same thing for journalism. It's like, yes, journalists are going to use GPT for everything now, but it lies. And if they're too lazy to, it's like either going to be people, there's going to be just people sitting there fact checking AI. And the thing, it's too dangerous. It's like, and people are going to be using it and following the advice of AI hallucinations, and they're going to forget what's real or not. I mean, it's like code is such a good example, because it's such a non-subjective thing. It either works or it doesn't. And even with code, it's like, I'll try to get it to help me write code, but then I have to fix its code. And if I didn't know how to code, I wouldn't know where it slipped up. It's like, it's not just going to be a magic thing that helps you do whatever you do. And I think that's, it's going to be weird. It's going to be weird for sure. But I mean, the danger there, like, people are worried about fake news now. I mean, the danger there is that not the late Terminators that are going to come kill us all, but we're all going to be relying for context and information for things on this thing that is just hallucinating.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. Yeah. Once you add, images, fake images into that, the potential for creating real chaos is, it's definitely there.
Do you have any thoughts on all that from kind of like a magical perspective?
Well, I think it's interesting that we've essentially, ended up in a world where language is this really powerful thing. And obviously, when you think about the very distant past, language was always associated with magic, right? Like Tahuti or Odin with the runes, and sorceresses who are able to enchant with their words, or the word spell, of course, meaning both to write something out and to cast the enchantment on someone or something. And now we've sort of ended up in this world where language is the ultimate reality. And I think, you kind of see this with people's identities, right? So they are one thing and they say they're another, but because they say they're another, that's what they are. And yeah, I think in a way, it's like we've passed through this world where the language was aligned to reality, right? So let's say that the shaman or the sorceress could create some effect in the world because the words were somehow aligned to reality and cause things to change in some way or another. Let's say like healing a person through some use of language or whatever, and then language itself becomes a reality in the modern age.
That is very magical in a way. You know, people are like throwing magical daggers at each other across the internet.
Yeah, that's right. And language is really what matters. And it matters in sort of postmodernism, but it matters, in the internet world. What someone says is more real than who they are or the person that they're speaking about. And now we've gone into this world where it's just total language, just pure language, and language is creating its own reality. And it's almost like this sort of leviathan of language itself, right? Where this multi-headed hydra is just creating reality out of language, and somehow that use of language not only creates a kind of reality, but creates the authority for the reality. So we either think this thing is real. So, someone submits an article to me written by ChatGPT. It's a large language program, but it's not very good, but he thinks it is because it was written by a program that is basically just a program about language and that has no actual contact with the reality, really.
Yeah, that's another very dangerous thing. It's like they may not even realize they're doing it. They're going to start using not just using GPT or language models for things, but they're going to start using it as a reference point in the sense of judging. Like, I'm just thinking of, judging in the same way that people use Google as a reference point, where Google is the arbiter of what's true or not, which is obviously not the case, but people, or Wikipedia, which anyone can edit.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not the case, but people use it as the gold standard. And I think I'm just thinking of your person who submitted an article to you. If somebody who's a skilled writer can have their goalpost subtly moved as to what they expect good writing to be by GPT, then that's troubling.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's right. Because by the time I got to the second paragraph, I already decided that this article was getting thrown out. And then at the end, I thought it was written by ChatGPT, and I just thought, good grief, that somebody would submit this. It would have been bad enough if it had been written by a person, but it's because it was written by ChatGPT, he was sort of blinded by the science of that.
Yeah. So, well, people are writing people are just hustling by having GPT write whole books that they're then putting on Amazon just to make a quick buck. Yeah. And it's just that's not going to last forever. Well, maybe we should wrap up by kind of, I should ask you, like, what's the way through this? I don't know if there's a way out of this, but what's the way through this? Because I'm not sure I have an answer for that.
Yeah, well, it's going to be really difficult to know, really. As over the next 2 to 3 years, these AI models become more and more integrated into business and into daily life. It's going to be difficult to know how to navigate that in advance. But I think definitely, knowing history, as you say, read old history books, probably from a century ago, so you can get actual facts. Because they try to actually present what happened, not just what happened in a way that suits our political cause.
Yeah, it's so sinister.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and other than that, I think I would say we have to start thinking about physical reality a lot more, making the body healthy, doing things in the real world, seeing friends offline, eating decent food, having some kind of actual community of people around you, and getting back to the physical world as much as possible. Actually, maybe, you know, making art in the physical world rather than on a computer.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Getting back to what's human.
Well, that sounds like a good job for magicians to show people.
Yeah,
do some DIY
definitely.
culture.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great conversation. And so let's put a bookmark in it for now and
Sure.
until the next time, I hope.
Absolutely.
Where can people find out more about you and your books?
They can go to angelmillar.com, ANGELMILLAR.com, or they can check me out on Inner Traditions as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you again. That was a great conversation.
Thank you. It was great speaking with you.
All right. Hope you really, really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magick.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.